We are back, and we are joined now by Alec Karakatsanis, founder of Civil Rights Core, author of Copaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Alec, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Your book comes out next week. Congratulations. Everybody can pre-order it and check it out, and we'll put a link down below because you've been a phenomenal writer and have other great books that people can check out. But this is just, it's so prescient because, and important for people to engage in this topic right now, because we just played with our previous guest this footage of ICE picking up a woman in Maryland, I believe. And she says, "You don't have a warrant. I want to talk to my lawyer." And the ICE agents break her window and open up the car and take her out. And apparently she's been in detention for like 11 days. And so I'm interested in how you observe this current political moment and how Copaganda, as you've studied it, has paved the way for the criminalization of immigrants, and it's been used to erode their rights.
Absolutely. My book is really about the role that liberal institutions, so the news media, and I don't focus on sort of the far right media in the book. I focus on sort of mainstream news media that's commonly considered to be liberal or progressive. But my book is really about how do liberal institutions like the news media, academic institutions. I have a lot of stuff in the book about the role that professors and universities play, and nonprofit organizations in kind of accepting and adopting and perpetuating a lot of the underlying assumptions, attitudes, and mythologies of the far right. And they put this sort of liberal veneer on them, but what they're actually doing, and there's so many subtle ways this happens every single day in the way the news is reported to us in terms of what stories are told, what stories are not told, what sources are used, what sources aren't used, what language is used, how they're framed. And the combination of all of those things changes our brain chemistry, makes us more susceptible to the authoritarian zeitgeist. And it's very important at this moment for all people of goodwill, at this moment of rising fascism, to really understand the role that these liberal institutions are playing, because they're walking us off a cliff.
And what are the hallmarks of Copaganda that these liberal institutions engage in? I think like people are probably familiar with the local news adage, if it bleeds, it leads. But it feels like that is almost just the tip of the iceberg of how Copaganda is in our daily lives and in our news media.
Yes, I mean, this book really came out of our work. I'm a civil rights lawyer. That's really my main job. This stuff, analyzing the news media and police, comes out of that work. It's sort of something I do on the side. But one of the most important things you have to understand, and civil rights lawyers and people who work inside the punishment bureaucracy understand it very well, is the police call themselves law enforcement, but that's really a term of propaganda. They want you to think that a law is broken, a law is enforced. But in reality, the police only enforce some laws against some people some of the time in some places. And the choice over, first of all, what to criminalize and how to criminalize it, but then the choice of where do you look for crimes. You know, for example, over the last 2-3 decades in the United States, there's been more arrests for possession of marijuana than all violent crime combined. The police spend only 4% of all their time on what they call violent crime. And so what you have to understand is that the news media, and I explain this in the book, and I think in a really fascinating chapter about the secret world of police public relations departments. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry sort of influencing, how we think, and they
here in New York, that's part of Zoran's campaign pledges. He wants to cut that budget, and people were laughing at him. No, it's significant.
Absolutely. There's over 80 people at NYPD. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department has 42 full-time employees as of a few years ago, working on manipulating the way you see them in the news and in TV. The LAPD has another 27 people. So just the two largest police departments in Los Angeles, and there's dozens more police departments in the LA area. Those two departments alone have 67 people working to manipulate how you experience the reality. And I think that the most important thing to understand is that the distortions in the understanding that police have about safety filter their way into the news. And so what happens with the news is that the news ends up, because of the role of police and a lot of multi-billion-dollar companies that kind of profit off of every step of the way in the criminal system, they focus on certain kinds of threats, but totally ignore other kinds of threats. So they focus a lot on, shoplifting. They created this kind of shoplifting epidemic in the news, right? At a time when actual shoplifting was down, we now know that. And property crime was at near 40-year lows in the United States. And at that time, for the last couple of years, they fomented a panic about retail theft. There were 309 articles about a single theft from a Walgreens in San Francisco a couple of years ago, okay? 309 articles. And at the same time, not a single article about much more serious wage theft by Walgreens of its employees. Wage theft is a $50 billion a year problem. That's about 5 to 6 to 7 times, depending on how you count, all other reported property crime combined in the United States. It's completely ignored in the news, even though it's much more consequential.
That is a great way to talk about COVID and its impact on Copaganda, right? Because there was a spike in violent crime in the pandemic after there's been precipitous decline for decades, starting to before I was even alive. That crime has been on the decline in the United States. And yes, the once-in-a-lifetime pandemic and the insecurity that it created did result in a kind of 2-year spike in violent crime. Just anecdotally, I got to say, it felt like, and then of course it precipitously declined after that in 2023 and in 2024 across the board, violent crime. And there was an increase, I think, in carjacking last year, but that was an exploitation of a bug in some of the cheaper models of cars that people were exploiting. Like it all fell off a cliff, these statistics. But you had Donald Trump and the Republicans running on crime, and you had even liberals kind of conceding this point without addressing the underlying statistics and what the factors were in causing this increase. And then paired with that, you had what you described, this like bunch of media outlets just taking Target and Walgreens' press releases at face value about why they were losing money, and they blamed it all on shoplifting without evidence. And then quietly, like 6 months later, some trade publication will be like, yeah, like it actually wasn't that. We put a Target in the wrong area of Manhattan, or and it didn't wasn't that profitable for us, so we blamed it on shoplifting or whatever. Like that was a whole multi-year propaganda effort, really, in my view, from 2020 to 2024.
Probably the most important piece of propaganda, if I had to pick one, in contemporary news discourse, is that fluctuations in police-reported crime, which again is only a tiny sliver of all the actual harm to people in the world, right? But fluctuations in police-reported crime, we are told by the news media, have to do with things like policing and bail reform and like length of sentences. And like, there was a whole propaganda spree around progressive prosecutors, like leading to the recall of a prosecutor in San Francisco. The idea that somehow his policies are affecting crime, that is like climate change denial, okay? There's a global warming like scientific consensus that the actual drivers of interpersonal harm in our world are not like how police are like walking the beat, or how many people police are arresting this year versus last year, or what a prosecutor's policies are, or whether the sentence you can get for a crime is 8 years or 6 years or 4 years. The actual drivers of harm are big things about our society, like poverty and inequality. Access to healthcare is huge. The single biggest driver in a lot of the research, in terms of like the number of actual arrests for interpersonal violence, is like access to healthcare for poor people. So you can actually look in these states that have expanded Medicaid. They've done these studies, dramatically reduces police-reported crime if you expand Medicaid. Things like early childhood education have a huge effect on crime for years. Things like isolation and loneliness and toxic masculinity, all of these things are shown in the research to actually be the drivers of crime. Another big one is exposure of children to lead. So So these are the
That
things.
aligned with the taking out of lead in paint and other and some replacing of pipes. Sorry, in the back half of the 20th century. Just wanted to put that out there.
And unleaded gasoline. Unleaded
Yeah.
gasoline was one of the big it looks like from the research that like taking lead out of gasoline was a huge driver of lower crime. So these are the things that actually drive crime. And so, but the conceit of the news media and virtually every single daily news story, whether it's TV or radio or podcast or the front page of the New York Times, it all suggests some connection between big crime trends and what the police are doing, and that is fundamentally probably the most key piece of propaganda, because what does that enable them to do? It enables them to boost police, prosecutors, and prisons, which people who own things in our society, very wealthy, elite people, they want that level of control and surveillance, and because it actually enables them to do something else, which is to control poor people. So while those policies don't actually prevent crime, they do permit extraordinary control over protests, over union and labor organizing, keeping very poor people at bay in their community, enforcing things like gentrification and the property values of developers and things like that. Like, they actually are quite important for those reasons, but they have nothing to do on like a macro level in any significant way with the actual levels of safety that we all experience. That's a really important thing to understand, and it's hard to believe that because we're so conditioned every single day to be linking police and crime. And police are one of the least important factors, and so are prisons and prosecutors and courts and jails, and like these things are just not that linked to how much crime there is in a society.
Can you expand on that point? Because people may not believe you. Like, people may hear what you're saying and say that can't be possible, because I hear on the news, if crime goes up, well, it must be because we fund the police. Or sorry, if crime goes down, it must be because we fund the police. If crime goes up, well, we need to fund the police more. Like, it's heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation for police.
Yeah, it's kind of like, whenever there's a cold day, someone comes on the TV and says there's no global warming. Like anybody can make any point they want with anecdotes, but when you actually look at the research, for example, the United States spends more money on police, prosecution, and prisons than any society in the history of the world. We are nowhere near the safest society. If more money on police, prosecution, and imprisoning people actually made us safer, we'd be the safest country in the history of the world. And we are now throwing people in jail cells at a rate 6 times our own steady historical average up until 1980. And we're throwing people in jail at like 5 to 10 times the rate of other countries. And all those other countries have lower rates of violence. So you have to understand that it has nothing to do with all the money we're throwing into these systems. Those systems have a different purpose. And what my book tries to do is walk you through every step of the way with the examples, and I try to also make it funny because this is a serious topic, but it's also fun to make fun of some of the journalists and others who engage in this kind of simplistic propaganda. Right. But like, I walk you through with the evidence and the research, and then try to give people the tools they need in their own communities to start having these conversations. And the other thing that we're doing with the book is we have, as with my last book, Usual Cruelty, free copies for any student, teachers, anybody in prison. They can all get free copies of the book, and all the royalties from the book are donated to charity. It's really about like getting these ideas out there, because in every other setting in our world, we are being relentlessly propagandized. We're being propagandized to be afraid of immigrants, to be afraid of strangers, to be afraid of poor people, to be afraid of people of color and Black people. In Washington, D.C., where I live, the Black people are arrested and jailed and imprisoned at 19 times the rate of white people. There is no public safety benefit associated with that, according to the research. So we have an emergency in this country, and the way that the liberal media and liberal Democratic Party politicians talk about these issues actually embraces all of the misinformation and mythologies of the far right. And that is such a dangerous thing to do in a moment when the far right is in the ascendance and is using all of the architecture of these systems to destroy any semblance of an opportunity of dissent and opposition. And we're in a period where if we don't get this right really soon, there may not be any going back.
Well, the architecture is clearly being used to both target, as we've discussed, anti-genocide demonstrators, and particularly folks who are here as immigrants, right? Like the erosion of due process and the conflation of immigrants having a civil violation of crossing the border without the proper documentation with violent criminals feels very much like, or associating them with gangs, right? Feels very much like propaganda that has been used on the local level for the past few decades, including gang databases, which is another way to criminalize poor people by trumping up charges against them so you can incarcerate them without having like a crime to charge them with. It just basically puts them in some sort of system where there's no accountability as to how they can get on it or get off of it. But if you're poor or black or Latino and you're in some city, there's a chance that you're on this database.
And the architecture for this, much of it was built by Democrats, whether it was Clinton and Biden in the 90s, and you have to also understand that the state and local punishment bureaucracies across the country are controlled by Democrats in most big cities. Obviously, the Republicans, the far right is weaponizing all of this stuff and is also a huge supporter. I mean, the police unions are all, supporting far right candidates. I'm not saying the Republicans are better or anything, but I am saying that this architecture was built and controlled by Democrats. And I have a lot of examples in the book of moments in history when Democrats and liberal journalists either knowingly or ignorantly spread arguments that directly led to the construction and profiteering and building of these exact systems, which are now being weaponized in ways that liberals seem to be afraid of. And it was very clear what was going on. And also, there's nothing really new about this. What I walk through in the book also, exactly how this is taken from stuff that happened in England. It's taken from stuff that happened in French and British colonies. It's taken from stuff that happened in prior periods in the US history, right? The otherization and the fear mongering around certain groups and the use of the fear around those groups to support repression of everybody is a very common historical tactic. It's been used in this country around Native people, Black people, LGBTQ people. It's been used around immigrants. At every key moment in history, the forces of repression kind of find key people to hate and to get everybody to hate. And they use that hatred and that fear to build up their own power, which they then use to control the entire population and to increase, the unequal distribution of wealth and power in our society. And so there's nothing new about what's happening now, except that now there are incredible technological tools at the disposal of these people. Power and wealth and technology have been centralized in fewer and fewer hands than ever before. And that makes some of the consequences of having built this architecture all the more dangerous, because it's very, very hard at this point for anybody to escape the level of power that the government has over our lives.
Can you give some more historical context about some of this? Because I remember as a teenager watching that documentary, The House I Live In, and it changed my perspective forever, right? It's just one of those moments where it clicks. And I still remember some of the details from that, which is that cannabis started to be called marijuana to associate it more with Latinos. There were articles in the South about Black people using cocaine to be able to stay up all night and steal your woman and also do all your work for you and steal your job. And opium for Chinese immigrants in California, that was also used as a way to disparage immigrants. And then that created the prohibition of these drugs that furthered the mass incarceration of the very people that they demonize via these stereotypes and usage of these drugs. And we're not out of the woods on the war on drugs, right? Like, as you just said, marijuana arrests are still dwarfing, I forget what the other point of comparison was, but a violent crime arrests in this country. So, if you could just talk more about that history of prohibition as well, of these kinds of drugs and how it's been used to target those specific groups.
Yeah, you have to understand that when something is made illegal, like a drug, what the government is doing is it's giving itself enormous power to selectively enforce those laws. So the drug laws there's been 40 or 50 million human beings with metal chains put on their bodies, separated from their families, and thrown into cages where they are at extraordinary risk of sexual and physical assault and death for the last 40, 50 years because of the so-called war on drugs. But those same drug laws are not enforced at Yale University dorm rooms or private boarding schools or Goldman Sachs weekend parties, right? So they are enforced in absolutely brutal fashion in the poorest communities in our country. So just because something is criminalized doesn't mean that it'll be equally enforced. And in fact, what you're doing is giving the government more power to selectively target people. So that is nothing new. And the examples that you gave of the history of marijuana prohibition and cocaine prohibition and opioids, there's a key part that to add to what you said, which is it wasn't just the government doing that. It was the New York Times.
Yes.
It was media oligarch, the Hearst newspaper publications that actually spread the fear of Mexican immigrants and the cannabis panic and epidemic. And it's this symbiotic relationship between people in power in the government and people in power in the news media who combine to kind of like turn what would be otherwise a brutal sort of elitist policy into kind of like conventional cultural consensus. And it's that process. And then at the same time, there were academics at Harvard and Princeton and Yale, all these fancy schools who were doing kind of fake nonsense research and opinion pieces. And they were validating at the same time all of this stuff, which, a lot of the stop and frisk stuff came out of elite academia, totally debunked. It's complete nonsense, right? And so I have a couple of chapters in the book where I actually take you through what I think are some horrific, but also extremely funny examples of, in particular, professors at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. But those are the stories I tell. But like the role of these elite institutions and the media in fomenting these panics is something that we absolutely have to study, because that what you described, the criminalization of certain substances that didn't used to be criminalized,
right,
or the enforcement of those laws doesn't just happen because the government wants it to. It needs a whole sort of apparatus of propaganda associated with it in order to validate and create kind of conventional wisdom around those policies. And the same is true, of course, of the demonization of immigrants. The same is true of in each generation, there are sort of different types of panics around different types of behavior. And I think the piece that I talk about in the book that makes it all just so clear is what some of the highest ranking aides to Richard Nixon said afterward. There's this famous admission that they made, which is that, and it's right there in the tapes. It's right there. You can see it. They said, we didn't care about, essentially what they were saying is we didn't care about drugs. It wasn't a problem. We understood, and Nixon had actually commissioned a blue ribbon panel of experts, and they actually recommended legalizing some of the drugs, right? He had thought he had stacked that commission with like police and other people, but when the experts actually studied it, and they didn't do any of this to reduce drug use or to make our society safer. They did it so they could have extra tools to target the anti-war movement and Black people. And they admitted that.
They said it. People can look up the quote. I think it wasn't the Nixon tapes, as you say.
It's Ehrlichman, I believe. John Ehrlichman, yeah.
Yeah. And like you even see, and when you put an industry like this underground too, right? When then these drugs start to get introduced to the United States, they are pigeonholed as like that they're made into kind of racist propaganda, but they're also addictive, and the demand continues to grow and grow and grow. Then you create an underground criminal network, or network of illegal sales, right? Here's the quote.
This is actually a different
ahead.
quote. This is from
Joe Kennedy
III. He literally said, when we decriminalized it, we actually had a pretty big consequence for the way that Massachusetts prosecutors went about trying cases in terms of, because an odor of marijuana was at least initially, I think is what that meant. Because marijuana was an illegal substance, if you smelled it in a car, you could search the car.
Right. So a precursor to criminalizing those people. But yeah, you basically create this whole different kind of pot of criminality that cops can tap into to further incarcerate the poor and discipline them, right? When you create this whole network of the economy that's underground, basically.
But I want to add one really key point, which is about propaganda, because this current book that I've written is all about how they get us to buy into this system and even support it and cheer it, right? And there's a really important propaganda point. So let's take this war on drugs that you're talking about. It's such a good example, right? If you look back since, like, let's say 1975, the United States has spent trillions of dollars. It has literally put in cages tens of millions of people. It's kicked millions of mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers and others out of public housing because some relative of theirs was arrested for marijuana. Yeah. It has firebombed and chemically sprayed millions of acres of land throughout Latin America, right? It has stopped, searched, and frisked hundreds of millions of people. It has surveilled the communications of billions of people. It has killed hundreds of thousands of human beings and separated millions and millions of children from their families, and on and on and on and on and on. All of those things. And yet, the availability of dangerous drugs today is more than it was at any prior time in that war.
Yep.
Dangerous, and the usage of dangerous drugs by young people is skyrocketed as well. And in terms of like overdose deaths and stuff like that, like overdose deaths are at an all-time highs. Okay. These are facts. The people who did the war on drugs and are still doing it, they know these facts. They're not like ignorant, right? Everyone in the system understands that the point of the war on drugs was never to reduce, the drugs are purer than they ever were. They're more widely available. More people are dying, right? Everyone understands that. And yet, if you go to any news article, Associated Press, New York Times, NBC News, etc., whenever they're talking about some kind of opioid law or new drug law or whatever, they almost always contain phrases like, and they're considering increasing the mandatory sentence in order to respond to the opioid crisis. There's this assumption of good faith, and that these stated reasons that politicians are saying they're going to a new undercover unit in order to combat the increase of opioid overdoses, or new penalties for prosecutors. All this stuff is treated by the news media at face value as if the reason that the government is doing this thing that everyone understands has nothing to do with the availability of drugs and is actually making the problem worse. But they're playing along with that propaganda game, and that gets to one of the themes of the book, which is the news media does an enormous disservice to us when they parrot these stated motives of people in power as their actual motives.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, and just to wrap up here, Alec, because I know you got to go, but just like the stated motives in public, but we have this quote. It's just so incredible. John Ehrlichman telling a Harper's writer back in 1968, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
And when you hear that quote,
yeah,
you're outraged. You understand it. But essentially every single day, and I walk through these examples in the book, the New York Times, the Atlantic, all these publications that liberals like are doing the exact same thing. They are pretending that the drug war policies or these other punishment-related policies are some attempt at public safety or reducing drugs or something like that, when everyone involved in them understands that they are about something else, which is controlling poor and marginalized people and profiting. And that myth, that lie, what I call in the book, that big deception, is sort of the core of what we have to understand if we're going to actually change how these issues are discussed in our society.
Well, I really, really appreciate you coming on today. People can pre-order the book or get it next week when it's out. I think April 15th, right, Alec?
Yeah, although I've heard that some people have already gotten their copies in the mail when they ordered it. So go for it.
All right, go for it. Check it out. Link down below. Alec Karakatsanis, founder of Civil Rights, core author of Copaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.